They dragged the rancher into the square just as the sun climbed high enough to strip the shade from every doorway, his boots skidding across hard-packed dirt while a knot of men hauled him forward as if he weighed nothing at all. And the sound drew people from the mercantile, the livery, the church steps, faces sharpening with interest the moment they understood this was not an accident but a lesson. He did not struggle, not because he lacked strength, but because he had learned how quickly resistance turned into permission, and when they shoved him to his knees near the well, the crowd closed in with the ease of habit, murmurs thick with judgment before a single charge was spoken aloud. Someone shouted that he had cheated a widow, another that he had refused a bribe he should have taken, accusations piling on top of each other until truth blurred into noise, and the sheriff stood nearby with his thumbs hooked in his belt, watching as if the order of things were unfolding exactly as expected. The rancher lifted his head once, searching for a face that might soften, but found only the familiar comfort of distance. Neighbors who had taken his beef and his labor, now studying the ground as if it had become suddenly interesting. Laughter broke out when a man kicked dust toward his chest, and the rancher felt the heat of shame rise, not for what they said, but for how easily they said it, how quickly a life could be folded into a story told by others. The sheriff cleared his throat and announced that the town would hear what it needed to hear, that silence would be kept until the matter was settled, and when the rancher tried to speak, a hard shove sent him forward again, palms scraping, the crowd's approval rolling over him like a wave. That was when she stepped out from the edge of the square, not running, not calling attention to herself, just moving with a steadiness that cut through the noise in a way shouting never could. And though she was smaller than most of the men there, her presence drew eyes because it did not ask permission. Someone told her to go back where she came from. Another laughed and said this was no place for a woman's concern. But she kept walking until she stood a few steps from the kneeling rancher, close enough that he could see the resolve in her face, even as she refused to look at him directly. The sheriff raised a hand, irritation flashing as he demanded she step aside, and she answered calmly that if the town meant to break a man in daylight, it would do so with witnesses who remembered, the words landing with a quiet weight that unsettled more than any threat. The square held its breath, unsure whether to jeer or listen, and in that pause, the rancher realized that whatever followed, something had already changed, because when no one else had stepped forward, she had, and the crowd's certainty had cracked just enough to let doubt in. The pause did not last long, because doubt was uncomfortable, and the town had learned to drown discomfort with noise. And soon the square filled again with voices eager to reclaim control of the moment, men calling out that this was none of her concern, women whispering that she always had ideas above her station, the sheriff reminding everyone that order required firmness, not sentiment. The rancher stayed on his knees, hands resting flat in the dirt to keep them from shaking, and listened as the story around him took shape without his consent. His refusal to sell land recast as greed, his quiet habits twisted into secrecy, each accusation polished by repetition until it sounded reasonable enough to believe. The woman remained where she was, not touching him, not shielding him fully, but close enough that her shadow fell across his shoulder, a small interruption in the clean geometry of humiliation, and that alone irritated the men who wanted the scene to move on. Someone shouted that the rancher had always thought himself better than the rest, that this was justice long overdue, and laughter followed, sharp and eager, because justice was easier to swallow when it looked like entertainment. The sheriff asked the woman if she intended to interfere further, his tone measured, and she answered that she intended to hear the charge, to understand what was being decided before a man was made an example. And the request drew groans from the crowd, impatience bubbling as if she were delaying a show they had already paid for with their attention. The rancher finally spoke then, voice rough but steady, saying he had done nothing that required this, and the sound of it seemed to anger them more than silence had, a man stepping forward to shout that his word meant nothing now, that the town had decided. The woman turned toward the speaker, meeting his gaze without raising her voice, and asked whether decision had replaced truth entirely, whether dragging a man to his knees was the same as proving him wrong. And though no one answered her, several looked away, the question lingering like a splinter. The sheriff announced that the rancher would remain there until evening if necessary. That order would be maintained, and with that declaration, the town relaxed, the promise of endurance restoring their confidence, because time was a powerful tool when used against someone with nowhere to go. The woman felt the eyes shift back to her, calculating what it meant that she had not moved, and she understood then that by stepping forward, she had taken on a role the town did not forgive easily, that of witness who refused to be satisfied. Yet she stayed, grounding herself in the simple fact of the rancher's presence beside her, and as the afternoon dragged on and the crowd settled into its cruelty, it became clear that the town did not care whether he was guilty or innocent, only that it needed a villain, and it had chosen him because he was quiet enough not to fight, back and visible enough to be broken in public. As the hours crept forward and the sun burned the square into a pale glare, the rancher's stillness began to unsettle people more than any protest ever could, because he did not curse, did not beg, did not shout his innocence to the sky, and in a place that expected either defiance or collapse, his quiet endurance felt like an accusation. Men circled him with careless steps, testing the edges of what they could do without consequence, one nudging his shoulder with a boot, another remarking loudly that a man who would not defend himself deserved whatever came next. And the rancher absorbed it all with his eyes lowered, not in submission, but in restraint, knowing that the smallest spark would be seized as proof. The woman watched closely, noticing the way his jaw tightened whenever an insult struck too close to truth, the way his hands pressed harder into the dirt when someone mentioned his father's name or the land he had refused to sell. And she understood then that this was not punishment for a single act, but for a lifetime of quiet refusals that had finally become inconvenient. The sheriff returned from the shade to announce that the town council would review the matter, his voice carrying the false comfort of process. And when the rancher lifted his head to ask how a council could decide what it had already condemned, the answer came in the form of laughter, sharp and collective, because men on their knees were not meant to question procedure. A boy tossed a pebble that struck the rancher's cheek, drawing a thin line of blood, and the woman stepped forward instinctively, only to stop herself, realizing that touching him now would turn concern into excuse. And so she spoke instead, asking whether cruelty had become the town's chosen evidence. The sheriff warned her again to mind her place, and she replied evenly that she was minding it, right here, where everyone could see. And the exchange drew a murmur that rolled through the square, not approval, but unease, the recognition that something had slipped beyond easy control. The rancher finally looked at her then, their eyes meeting for the first time, and in his gaze she saw not despair, but a weary gratitude, the acknowledgement of a man who had not expected help and did not know how to ask for it. And the sight steadied her more than any reassurance could have. As the afternoon lengthened and the crowd's energy thinned into irritation, the rancher remained on his knees, blood drying on his cheek, dignity intact in the only way left to him. And the woman understood with growing clarity that his refusal to fight back was not weakness, but a final line he would not cross, a choice to endure humiliation rather than give the town the satisfaction of breaking him on its own terms. When the sheriff returned again, his expression had settled into the practiced calm of a man prepared to let time do his work, and he announced that the rancher would remain under watch until the council convened, a decision framed as fairness, but delivered with the casual cruelty of certainty. The crowd accepted it readily, drifting in and out of the square, returning whenever boredom or curiosity pulled them back, confident that the man on his knees would still be there, because the law had decided to look away rather than intervene. The woman stayed too, standing through the heat and the whispers, feeling the weight of each passing hour settle into her legs, and she noticed how the sheriff's deputies avoided her eyes now, their authority diminished by the simple fact that someone remained who would remember. The rancher's shoulders sagged as exhaustion crept in, and when he swayed, a deputy stepped forward as if to push him back into place, only to stop short when the woman's voice cut in, asking whether balance required force or simply patience, the question hanging unanswered. The sheriff warned her that continued interference would be noted, his tone cool, and she replied that she had no objection to being noted, that some records mattered more than comfort. And the exchange drew another ripple of murmurs, the crowd unsure whether to mock or retreat. A man near the well laughed and said this was what happened when women forgot their sense, and the woman turned toward him, asking whether sense included watching a neighbor be ruined for convenience. And though he scoffed, he did not meet her gaze. The rancher tried again to speak, voice hoarse now, asking to know the charge, the timeline, the evidence, and the sheriff answered with a reminder that cooperation would be remembered favorably, a thinly veiled threat that made several onlookers shift uneasily because they recognized it for what it was. The afternoon dragged on, shadows stretching across the square, and the law's absence became more visible than its presence, the space where protection should have been filled instead with procedure and delay. The woman felt anger stir beneath her calm, not loud or reckless, but steady. And she realized that the law was not neutral here, that by choosing not to act it had chosen a side, one that relied on exhaustion to finish what accusation had begun. As the sun dipped and the crowd thinned again, the rancher remained where he was, a living exhibit of patience tested beyond reason, and the woman knew that if nothing changed before nightfall, the town would claim his collapse as proof of guilt and call it justice without ever having to raise a hand. It was near evening when the woman finally moved again, not because the cruelty had lessened, but because endurance had reached its limit, and she understood that waiting any longer would only serve the town's plan to let exhaustion finish what accusation had begun. She stepped closer to the rancher, close enough that her voice did not need to rise, and asked the sheriff directly whether a man on his knees was still considered under investigation or already judged, the question plain and careful, leaving no place for easy answers. The sheriff bristled, reminding her that procedure took time, that order was not rushed for comfort, and she answered that order without truth was only delay dressed up as law, words that drew a sharp intake of breath from the crowd because they named what many had avoided saying aloud. Someone shouted that she had no standing here, that this was men's business, and she turned toward the voice, asking whether dignity had become gendered, whether justice required a certain kind of body to speak its name, and the man fell silent beneath the attention he had been so eager to give moments earlier. The rancher shifted, trying to rise and failing, his strength spent, and before anyone could twist that into proof, the woman knelt beside him, not to replace his position, but to change the meaning of it, placing herself at his level where everyone could see. A ripple passed through the square, discomfort spreading as the spectacle shifted from a single broken figure to a choice freely made. And the sheriff warned her that this was highly improper, that she risked consequences she could not undo. She acknowledged the risk without argument, saying only that she had already watched a man be undone in daylight and would not pretend that silence had kept her clean. The crowd reacted unevenly, some scoffing, others stepping back as if unsure how to read this new shape of defiance, and the rancher looked at her with quiet disbelief, his voice barely audible as he told her she did not have to do this. She met his gaze steadily and replied that she knew that choice was the point, and in saying it, she felt the last of her fear loosen its grip. The sheriff called for the deputies, ordering them to remove her, but when none moved immediately, the delay spoke louder than refusal, revealing cracks in an authority that relied too heavily on assumption. She rose then, standing alone between the rancher and the crowd, and declared that if the town intended to break him, it would have to do so openly, without hiding behind time or silence, and that she would remain to witness every moment. The square held in a tense stillness, the weight of her stand pressing against the easy cruelty that had brought them all here, and the rancher understood then that whatever came next, he was no longer alone in his humiliation, because someone had chosen to share the cost of standing when no one else would. The reaction was swift once the woman placed herself between the rancher and the town, the crowd's attention swinging toward her with a sharpness that felt almost relieved, because cruelty preferred a moving target, and she had just made herself one. Whispers spread first, then louder remarks about her meddling, her past, her place, men who had nodded politely to her in other settings, now speaking as if they had always known she would be trouble, and the sheriff seized the shift, warning her that interference would be remembered, that standing where she stood carried consequences she might regret once the square emptied. She listened without flinching, aware that the ground beneath her feet felt suddenly less solid, not because she doubted herself, but because she understood how quickly belonging could be revoked, how easily a woman could be folded into the same story of suspicion now clinging to the man beside her. Someone called out that she had no family worth protecting, another that she must have reasons for caring so much about a disgraced rancher. Insinuations tossed lightly but meant to stain, and she felt the heat rise in her chest, not fear this time, but a fierce clarity that the town would invent whatever it needed to justify its anger. The sheriff ordered the deputies to clear space. His voice edged now, and when they moved hesitantly, uncertain which direction authority truly lay, the crowd sensed it, pressing closer with a nervous energy that fed on itself. The rancher tried again to rise, bracing his hands against the well's stone rim, and though he failed, the effort drew a murmur that cut both ways. Pity tangled with resentment, because endurance made some people uncomfortable. The woman spoke then, not loudly, but with enough steadiness to carry, saying that if the town intended to punish her for standing, it should do so plainly, without disguising it as concern, and the words struck a nerve, because they stripped away the pretense that had sheltered so much of what was happening. The sheriff responded by announcing that her name would be recorded, that her actions would be noted, should questions arise later, a threat shaped like administration, and she accepted it with a nod, understanding that reputation was a currency this place spent freely. The crowd reacted with uneven satisfaction, some emboldened by the promise of consequence, others suddenly aware that lines were being crossed in daylight. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that stretched across the square, the woman felt the weight of her choice settle fully, knowing that whatever protection she once enjoyed here was thinning by the minute. Yet she did not step back, because retreat now would confirm the town's belief that pressure always won. Beside her, the rancher breathed shallowly, exhaustion etched into every line of him, and she realized that standing had already cost her a name she might never fully reclaim, but it had also given her something steadier, the certainty that dignity, once chosen openly, was worth whatever a small town decided to take in return. Night came down slowly, as if the town itself needed time to decide what it had done, and when the square finally emptied, the rancher was allowed to rise only because there was no audience left to satisfy. His legs stiff and unsteady as he pushed himself upright with the well's stone rim biting into his palms. The woman stayed close without touching him, matching his pace as they moved away from the center of town, along a side street lit by uneven lanterns, the quiet between them careful rather than awkward, both of them aware that speaking too soon might spill something fragile. He stopped once to steady himself, breath shallow, and she waited without urging, giving him the dignity of his own timing. And when he managed to continue, the simple act felt like a victory neither of them named. They reached a small shed near the edge of the fields where he sometimes kept tools, its door hanging crooked, the smell of hay and oil grounding in its familiarity, and inside the shadows felt kinder than the square ever had. She offered him water, turning her gaze aside as he drank, and the courtesy eased something tight in his chest, because it was the first kindness he'd been allowed all day without condition. For a long moment they stood there listening to the town settle into its nighttime rhythms, laughter drifting from the saloon, a door slamming, a horse snorting somewhere in the dark, reminders that life went on easily for those untouched by shame. He spoke first, voice rough, telling her she had no obligation to stay, that what she did would follow her in ways neither of them could predict, and she answered that she knew, that she had watched how the town kept score, and that leaving him alone now would cost her more than staying. He admitted then that he had expected this day for a long time, that refusing certain deals and favors had made him useful until it made him inconvenient, and that inconvenience was the one thing a town never forgave. She listened without interrupting, understanding that the story mattered less than the courage it took to tell it aloud after being forced to kneel in front of neighbors. Outside, footsteps passed too close to be accidental, then moved on, and both of them felt the warning in it, the promise that daylight cruelty often tried to finish its work after dark. She asked where he would go if the town closed itself to him completely, and he hesitated, admitting he had not planned beyond endurance, that survival had taken all the room where futures were meant to grow. She considered that quietly before saying she would walk with him as far as the river if needed, no further promise than presence, and the offer landed with a weight he did not resist. As the night deepened and they sat on overturned crates, sharing the thin warmth of the shed without touching, he understood that what had happened in the square had not ended with sunset, but something else had begun, quieter and more dangerous to the towns. Certainty, because a woman had chosen to stand in daylight and then stayed when the lights went out. And that choice, unannounced and unadorned, was already reshaping what tomorrow could demand of them both. The sound came just before dawn, a low murmur outside the shed that did not belong to animals or wind, and the rancher was awake the instant it reached him, his body remembering the square before his mind caught up, muscles tightening as footsteps paused too close to the door to be passing by. The woman stirred beside him, reading the danger in his stillness, and when a knuckle rapped once against the wood, not loud enough to draw notice, she felt the truth settle cold in her stomach, because cruelty rarely announced itself twice. A voice whispered his name, friendly on the surface, edged with warning beneath, telling him it would go easier if he stepped outside alone, that the town only wanted to finish what had already been decided, and the rancher closed his eyes briefly, understanding that endurance had limits the crowd was counting on. He rose quietly, meaning to answer, meaning to keep the trouble from her, but the woman moved first, placing herself between him and the door without touching, her presence a clear refusal, and she called out that whatever was said would be said in daylight or not at all. The reply was a soft laugh and the scrape of boots shifting, a man muttering that she should remember her place, another that she had already made enough trouble for one lifetime, and the threat slid through the cracks like smoke, promising consequences that would never be claimed. The rancher felt the familiar urge to comply, to end it cleanly, yet something held him back now, the memory of her kneeling in the square beside him, choosing exposure over safety, and he understood that stepping out alone would undo everything she had risked. She spoke again, louder this time, naming the men she recognized by voice, calling them neighbors, not monsters, and asking whether they were prepared to be known for what they were doing, the question striking harder than accusation because it left no shadow to hide in. Silence followed, thick and uneasy, the men weighing the cost of daylight against the satisfaction of finishing him quietly. And in that pause, the river nearby kept its steady sound, indifferent but constant. One voice spat a curse and said this was not over, that the town would not forget, and another agreed, promising that the rancher would not be welcome come morning, but the boots retreated all the same, their anger losing shape as distance grew. When the last sound faded, the rancher let out a breath he had been holding since the square, his legs unsteady again as he leaned against the wall, and the woman remained where she was until the light crept in through the cracks, certain the danger had passed. They did not speak at first because there was nothing left to explain, and when he finally thanked her, the word felt too small for what she had done, but she accepted it anyway, understanding that standing in daylight had drawn the line and standing in the dark had kept it, and that together those choices had denied the town the ending it wanted, forcing whatever came next to happen where it could be seen. Morning returned with a thin, colorless light that flattened the fields and made the town look smaller than it had the day before. And when they walked back toward the square together, the quiet felt heavier than any shouting, because it carried the memory of what had almost been done in the dark. Word had traveled faster than they had, carried by looks that lingered too long and conversations that stopped short when they passed, and by the time they reached the well, a handful of townspeople were already there, drawn less by curiosity now than by the uneasy sense that something had gone wrong. The sheriff stood stiffly with two deputies, his authority no longer relaxed but tight, as if he were bracing against a shift he could not fully control, and the rancher felt the old pull to lower his head, to let habit decide his posture. But the woman's presence at his side steadied him, a reminder that yesterday's kneeling had not been consent. The sheriff began to speak of order and misunderstandings, framing the night's visit as concern taken too far, and before the story could settle into something comfortable, the woman interrupted, naming what had happened plainly, the knock before dawn, the voices, the demand that he step outside alone. And as she spoke, faces in the small crowd turned, recognition flickering in places that had not expected to be seen. The rancher added his own account then, voice rough but clear, describing the same threats without embellishment, and the simplicity of it robbed the sheriff of room to maneuver, because denial would have required calling them both liars in full daylight. A murmur spread, some defending the men by saying no harm had been done, others insisting that threats counted even when fists did not fall, and the divide made itself visible, the town forced to choose which version of itself it wished to recognize. The sheriff saw the balance tipping and acted quickly, announcing that any deputy involved would be suspended pending inquiry. that intimidation would not be tolerated, the word stiff but necessary, because authority survived only by appearing decisive when watched. It was not justice in any grand sense, not apology or restoration, but it was exposure. And exposure mattered in a place that relied so heavily on what went unseen. As the small crowd dispersed, quieter and less certain than before, the rancher felt something ease in his chest, knowing the town had not become kind overnight, but it had been made to look at itself. And that mattered. The woman did not claim victory or press for more, understanding that pushing now would only harden resistance, and when they turned away from the square together, it was with the shared knowledge that dignity had been reclaimed without a blow struck, and that the town's cruelty, dragged into daylight and named, had lost the quiet protection it depended on to survive. They left the town before the sun climbed high enough to warm the rooftops, taking the dirt road that bent away from the square and followed the fence line toward open land. And with every step, the rancher felt the tightness in his chest ease, not because what had happened was forgotten, but because it no longer owned his posture. He walked beside her without hurry, aware of the quiet space between them that did not need filling, forged as it was by hours of shared risk rather than promises spoken too soon. And when he glanced back once at the town shrinking behind them, it was not with bitterness, but with a clear understanding of what he was leaving behind. He told her then that kneeling in the square had not been the worst part, that the worst had been realizing how easily his neighbors accepted it, how quickly familiarity turned into permission, and she listened without trying to soften the truth, knowing that dignity returned only when pain was allowed its full shape. They stopped near the river where the land opened wide, and the noise of the town could no longer reach them, and she asked what he would do next, the question offered without expectation, and he admitted he did not know, that his plans had ended at endurance, that surviving the day had taken all the space where futures were meant to grow. She considered this quietly before saying she would walk with him for a while. No claim beyond the road ahead, no promise beyond presence, and the simplicity of it settled something inside him that shame had tried to hollow out. As they continued on, he realized that what she had saved was not his reputation or his standing, both of which the town would rewrite regardless, but his belief that a man could be brought low without being erased, that humiliation did not have to become identity. She, in turn, understood that standing for him had not been an act of rescue, but of recognition, a refusal to let cruelty define what was true, and that in doing so, she had claimed something for herself as well, a steadiness she would not surrender again. The road stretched ahead, uncertain and unmarked, and neither of them pretended otherwise. Yet the uncertainty felt different now, lighter somehow, because it was chosen rather than imposed. As the morning warmed and the town disappeared completely from view, the rancher walked upright for the first time since the square, not because he had been restored by law or forgiven by a crowd, but because a woman had stepped forward when no one else did. And in that choice, she had given him back something the town could never take again, the quiet, unshakable knowledge that dignity, once reclaimed in daylight, could survive whatever lay beyond the next rise. Some towns don't need proof to condemn a man. They only need silence. And sometimes love doesn't arrive as comfort or rescue, but as a single step forward when everyone else steps back. This was not a story about a crowd that learned mercy, but about a woman who refused to let humiliation decide a man's worth. And in that refusal, something stronger than reputation survived.